Welcome back to Spirits in the Shadow. What you are about to hear is based on a true story, my story. It all happened when I was a student living in a small apartment in Tokyo. I always laugh at ghost stories, but one night, something in my room started whispering my name from the corner of the ceiling. It was a sound I could never forget. I share this to warn you. What I saw that night changed everything I thought I knew about reality. Keep listening to find out what happens next, and maybe you'll understand why I'll never be the same again. A legend we laughed about until it happened. Before I moved to Japan, my life was aggressively normal. I was just another graduate from Boston with a degree in architecture and a decent job offer from a firm in Tokyo. The goal was simple: work for 2 years, gain international experience, and maybe learn enough Japanese to order something more interesting than ramen. Love wasn't on the agenda, and adventure was limited to navigating the Shinjuku station during rush hour. I was a practical person, grounded in blueprints and building codes, not folklore. My world was made of solid lines and measurable angles, a place where legends had no footing. My new apartment was the definition of a standard Tokyo living space: compact, efficient, and relentlessly beige. It was a single room that served as my bedroom, living room, and dining area, with a kitchenette tucked away by the entrance. It was nothing special, just a temporary home on the 12th floor of a concrete high-rise. Like millions of others, I fell into a comfortable routine: the morning commute on a packed train, long hours at the office surrounded by the quiet hum of computers, and evenings spent either with colleagues or exploring the city's endless maze of streets. It was a life of predictable patterns, the kind where you could easily forget you were in a foreign country. It was during a company dinner that I first heard the story. My co-worker, David, laughing over a shared bottle of sake, told me about the Tsukima Onna, the woman in the gaps. Before coming to Japan, I had heard the legend called the woman in the gaps, a woman in narrow crevices. Unlike the long-haired ghosts or white-robed figures of popular horror, she was an entity of subtlety. She hides in the forgotten spaces of our lives: the crack in a wall, the sliver of darkness between a bookcase and the wall, the narrow gap under a bed. She occupies the places we never notice. "If you accidentally look into a narrow space," David said, lowering his voice for dramatic effect, "you might see a pair of eyes staring right back at you. In Japan, they say she exists in the spaces between dimensions, a phantom trapped between two worlds." The table erupted in laughter, and I chuckled along with them. It was a fascinating, creepy piece of local folklore, perfect for a late-night scare. The real chilling part, David added, wasn't just seeing her. It was that once you made eye contact, just for a second, she would remember you forever. I dismissed it as a fun, spooky story. But that night, as I unlocked the door to my perfectly ordinary apartment, the legend followed me home. For the first time, I saw my small room not as a single space, but as a collection of objects with gaps between them. The 4 inches separating my refrigerator from the wall, the dark sliver behind my headboard, the paper-thin crack in the plaster near the ceiling. My normal, relatable world was suddenly filled with countless narrow spaces, and the thought, however irrational, began to take root. This could happen to me. It began with a sound so trivial it was barely worth noticing: a faint, dry scratching from the narrow space between the wall and a heavy oak bookshelf. Marco, a diligent Osaka University student, paused his reading, listening to the skittering interruption in the late-night quiet of his small apartment. He rationalized it instantly and with the easy logic of a pragmatist. The building was old, and rats were a common, if unpleasant, fact of life. He slid his headphones on, turned up his music, and drowned out the noise, dismissing the pest that dared disturb his focus. For anyone watching, however, the sound was not the frantic, chaotic scrambling of a rodent. It was too patient, too rhythmic. This was the first soft note in a composition of dread, a clear and unambiguous warning that the thing in his walls was not some simple vermin. Days later, a new sound joined the first, one far more difficult to dismiss. It was a soft, wispy exhalation, a slow and steady breathing that seemed to seep directly from the dark crevice. Marco pulled his headphones off, his heart suddenly beating faster. He leaned in, pressing his ear to the wood, and could just make out the faint, airy whisper beneath the bass thumping from next door. A cold sweat prickled his neck, but his mind scrambled for a foothold of normalcy. It had to be a draft, he concluded, the wind working its way through a crack in the building's old foundation. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was enough to keep the terror at bay, a shield of denial against an encroaching fear. This is the crucial moment where a character makes a conscious choice to ignore what their instincts are screaming. The audience understands that the wind does not breathe on a steady cycle. The warning has been escalated, and the character's willful ignorance is sealing his fate. The final sign appeared on a night steeped in an unnatural silence. The scratching had stopped, the breathing had ceased. The void left behind was heavy, watchful, and infinitely more terrifying. A morbid curiosity, an instinct he should have violently suppressed, forced Marco to turn his head slowly toward the gap. There, pressed impossibly tight against the plaster, was a face. It was paper white, its features distorted and flattened by the pressure of the narrow space. Its eyes were dark, vacant pools, and its mouth was stretched into a wide, grotesque smile that conveyed no joy, only a silent, chilling madness. Marco's logic, his rationalizations, his carefully constructed reality, it all shattered in an instant. He didn't scream. The sound was strangled in his throat by pure, undiluted horror. He scrambled backward, his chair clattering to the floor as he fled his room and ran into the night. When his friends, alerted by a string of incoherent, panicked messages, came to check on him the next morning, they found the apartment door unlocked. They called his name into the silence. Cautiously they entered, finding only the overturned chair to suggest anything was amiss. Then one of them gasped. Marco was there. He had been forced, somehow, into that same impossible gap between the bookshelf and the wall, his body wedged and contorted. His eyes were wide open, staring sightlessly out into the room. And fixed upon his face was a terrifying replica of the smile he had seen in the wall, a permanent, silent grin of absolute horror. The police were baffled. His death ruled an inexplicable and tragic accident. But the students in the dorms knew. They began to whisper about his room, giving it a new name born from their fear. The Gap Room. The ghost stories were a mistake. What began as a night of silly, manufactured frights bled into the following days, leaving a residue of unease that clung only to me. It started with the whispers. The first time, I was washing dishes while my cousins, Leah and Nora, were in their rooms. It was a faint, sibilant hiss, like the ghost of a sound just at the edge of hearing. I turned off the tap, listening intently. Nothing. "Did you say something?" I called out. Their muffled replies from behind closed doors confirmed they hadn't. I brushed it off as the building's old pipes, a phantom of my overactive imagination. But it happened again the next night, and the night after. A soft, breathy whisper with no discernible words, always there when I was alone in a quiet room. Soon, objects began to find new homes. A small ceramic bird I kept on my windowsill appeared on the kitchen counter. My favourite pen, which I always left on my desk, would be on the floor by the front door. Each time I pointed it out, my cousins had a logical explanation. "The window must have been open. The wind probably knocked it down," Leah would say without looking up from her textbook. "I might have borrowed your pen and forgot to put it back," Nora would offer with a placating smile. They were small, plausible things, but they were happening too often. Their rationalizations started to feel less like comfort and more like a gentle, united dismissal of my growing anxiety. I was the imaginative one, the one still spooked from our ghost stories. The intensity grew. The whispers gained a certain cadence, almost like a lullaby sung in a language I didn't know. One evening I felt it, a cold spot in the hallway, a pocket of air so frigid it raised goosebumps on my arms despite the warmth of the apartment. I mentioned it, my voice trembling slightly. Nora walked right through the spot. "I don't feel anything," she said, looking at me with an expression that mingled pity and concern. "You look pale. Maybe you're catching a cold." They didn't hear the whispering that followed me down the hall. They didn't feel the chill that clung to my skin. The true terror began when I saw the smudge on the inside of my bedroom window, which overlooked a sheer drop. It looked like a handprint, but longer, with fingers too thin to be human. I called them in to see, my heart pounding against my ribs. Leah cleaned it with a cloth, her movements brisk and annoyed. "It's just condensation, see? It happens." But as she wiped it away, my eyes locked on the balcony door at the other end of the living room. For a split second, I saw the handle turn, slowly, deliberately, on its own. I let out a small gasp, pointing, but by the time they turned to look, it was still. They just shook their heads. It was in that moment, standing between their placid disbelief and the silent, undeniable wrongness of the handle, that I understood I was completely alone in this. The apartment was no longer a happy, peaceful home. It was a stage for a performance only I was allowed to see. And the calm was a memory I could no longer trust. The cicadas were the heartbeat of our summer nights, a relentless, pulsating chorus that cradled the village in a familiar rhythm. But on that one sweltering evening, their song didn't fade. It was violently severed. One moment, the air vibrated with their sound, and the next, a profound and absolute silence descended, so heavy it felt like the entire countryside was holding its breath, waiting. That was the first sign. That was when my grandmother, then a young woman, felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. Her gaze was drawn to the shoji window, its paper screen made translucent by the thick, cloying humidity of the night. A figure stood just beyond it, a stark, motionless silhouette against the pale moonlight. It wasn't the shape that terrified her, but the unnatural stillness of it. The head was tilted at an angle that seemed wrong, a gesture of morbid curiosity. And then it moved closer, pressing itself against the fragile paper until the details came into horrifying focus. There, illuminated by the dim glow from her lamp, were two eyes, flat, stark white, and utterly devoid of pupil or life. They were like polished stones, ancient and empty. The thing pressed its face harder against the glass, the paper straining as if it might tear. It was a shadow given form, a void in the shape of a person, but there was no mouth to scream, no nose to breathe. Only those two pale, luminous circles that stared directly into her soul. They weren't just looking, they were consuming, stripping away her sense of safety, her belief in a rational world. The sight was a visceral shock, a silent, visual scream that bypassed her ears and lanced straight into her mind. My grandmother was frozen, pinned to her futon by a force more potent than any physical restraint. A scream was trapped in her throat, a desperate, clawing thing with nowhere to go. Her limbs were leaden, her muscles refusing every frantic command from her brain. She was utterly powerless, a spectator to her own violation, her heart hammering against her ribs in a frantic, silent drumbeat. All she could do was stare back into that featureless void, a silent participant in a horrifying tableau. As suddenly as it appeared, the figure receded into the oppressive darkness, and the world seemed to rush back in. The silence was broken, not by the cicadas, but by the frantic thumping of her own blood in her ears. For a long moment, she didn't move, her body still locked in terror. When she finally found the strength to look away from the window, her breath hitched. There, shimmering in the lamplight on the tatami mat beside her bed, were two perfect wet footprints. The window was locked, the door was barred, but the prints were there, cold and undeniable, a chilling testament to its impossible presence. From that day forward, my grandmother never opened her window after dark again. The memory of those pale, empty eyes was a permanent seal against the night. If this story sent a shiver down your spine, please leave a comment with your own chilling encounters and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. The deafening bang of the window slamming shut was not just a sound, it was a final, violent verdict. In that single, heart-stopping moment, every rationalization we had clung to, faulty hinges, drafts, old construction, was shattered, leaving only the raw, chilling certainty of a malevolent presence. There was no discussion, no shared glance of terror with my cousin. My body acted on an instinct far older and more potent than thought. I scrambled backward from the kitchen table, the chair screeching against the floor before toppling over. My only thought was out. I fled the house in a blind panic, not even pausing to grab my keys or shoes. I remember fumbling with the front doorknob, the same one that had shaken so violently in my waking nightmare, and the cold, familiar metal felt alien and menacing against my skin. The door swung open, and I burst into the harsh afternoon light, gasping for air as if I'd been held underwater. I ran, my bare feet slapping against the hot pavement, and I didn't look back. That house, with its watchful silence and sudden fury, was a cage I had just broken out of, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never, ever return. Abandoning the house meant abandoning a life. Clothes, books, photographs. All of it was left behind, sacrificed to the unseen thing that had claimed the space as its own. But you don't walk away from an experience like that and leave the fear behind with your material possessions. The scars it left are etched into my mind, invisible to others, but a constant reality for me. To this day, the rattle of a loose window pane sends a jolt of ice through my veins. I can't sleep in a room unless the door is securely locked, a futile defense against the memory of that turning knob. I often wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, with the phantom sensation of sleep paralysis pinning me to the mattress, my heart hammering as I stare into the darkness, half expecting to see the handle begin to turn on its own. I survived, but it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like I barely managed to slip through the cracks. We didn't confront the entity. We didn't cleanse the house. We simply ran. There is a deep, unsettling feeling that I didn't truly escape anything, but was merely allowed to leave. It's the feeling of a predator letting its prey go, knowing it can find it again whenever it wishes. I live with the constant, quiet dread that what was in that house didn't just haunt a place, but that it took notice of us. And I'm terrified that one day, when I least expect it, I'll hear a familiar, violent rattle on the doorknob of a new home. The apartment, I learned, was built on the ashes of an old tenement that had burned down decades ago. A fire, started by faulty wiring in a bathroom, had claimed a single victim, a young woman named Clara. She was an aspiring actress, known for her radiant smile and the expressive performances she practiced tirelessly in front of her mirror. The fire had been merciless, consuming one side of her body, her face, her dreams. She died there, trapped between the flames and her own reflection. Her final moments a horrific tableau of agony and despair. They said her biggest fear wasn't the fire, but the thought of no one ever seeing her face on a stage, of being forgotten. My frantic escape led me not away from the horror, but deeper into it. I found myself at the local library's archives, driven by a desperate need to understand what I had seen. An old, yellowed newspaper article, dated almost 50 years prior, recounted the tragedy of the tenement fire. It included a photo of the aspiring actress, Clara, beautiful and whole, a vibrant smile gracing her lips. The report detailed the fire's origin, pinpointing the bathroom of her unit. It spoke of her unidentifiable remains, with the coroner noting the severe damage to the right side of her face and body. The most chilling detail, however, came from a witness account, a firefighter who claimed that the only thing left relatively intact in the bathroom was a large ornate mirror, its surface strangely clear amidst the soot and destruction. Suddenly, everything clicked into a sickening, coherent picture. The apparition wasn't just a random spectre, it was Clara. The location was no coincidence. The bathroom was where her life had been so brutally extinguished. The mirror was her stage, the only one she had left. The half-burnt face I saw wasn't just a grotesque mask. It was the literal truth of her agonizing end. A permanent scar she carried into the afterlife. The smile, that unnerving, lipless grin, wasn't one of malice, but of desperate performance. She was still trying to act, to be seen, even in death. The feeling of being watched, the subtle shifts in the corner of my eye, were all her attempts at gaining an audience. The reason she appeared when I was alone was because that's when she had the stage to herself. With a solitary audience member, she couldn't bear to let leave. My apartment wasn't just haunted. It was her eternal, tragic theatre, and I had become her unwilling spectator. The face in the reflection wasn't a monster trying to get in. It was a soul trapped within, forever rehearsing a final scene that never got its applause. What do you think? After hearing a story like this, will you be looking at the empty spaces in your room the same way again? The chilling presence the narrator felt is known in Japan as a jibakure, difuling. This isn't just a random ghost, it's a specific and terrifying concept from Japanese folklore. The term translates to earthbound spirit, a soul that is tethered to the exact location where it died, often due to a sudden, violent, or deeply emotional event. Unable to pass on, the jibakure remains a permanent fixture of the place, an unseen observer in the gaps and cracks. As the teacher in the story explains, their influence inevitably seeps into the lives of anyone who dares to inhabit their space. The feeling of being watched, the unexplainable dread, it's the signature of a soul that can never leave. Have you ever felt an unexplainable presence in a familiar place? Share your theories and your own chilling encounters in the comments below. We want to hear what you think. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories we unearth from the shadows.